Hello, everybody, and I want to welcome you to our event, Grounds That Shout and Others Merely Shaking, which is a conversation featuring Reggie Wilson in dialogue with Jasmine Johnson, John Jackson, and Jawole Zollar, all of whom I will introduce in just a minute. My name is Deborah Thomas, and I'm the R.G. Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography here at Penn. I want to let you know that I am speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape peoples. We take this opportunity to honor the past, present, and futures of the Lenape, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and come to nurture this land. I acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples through land theft, deceit, violence, and colonial knowledge production. In that recognition, we at the CEE denounce any attempt to legitimate, update, revise the doctrine of discovery or any other justification for ongoing processes of settler colonialism in any form. I also wanted to remind everyone that the Center for Experimental Ethnography is located in the Penn Museum, which houses the Samuel Morton Cranial Collection and which for over 3 decades held, researched, and taught with the remains of Tree and Delisha Africa, 2 children killed when the city of Philadelphia dropped 2 bombs on the MOVE compound in 1985. Repatriating the remains to the family, while necessary, is not enough. I'm speaking of the dead not only to call the discipline, the museum, and the university to account for the white supremacy and imperialism that is at their foundation, but also to remind us of the difficult context in which we celebrate Black life, which is what we are doing here today. I couldn't be more excited to introduce this event. And I'd like to give you a little background about how we arrived here. Reggie, if you want, you can unmute your video now as I'm telling our story. 3 years ago, Harry Philbrick, who is the founding director of Philadelphia Contemporary, told me that they had received funding from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage to collaborate with Dance Space Project and Partners for Sacred Places to bring Reggie Wilson to Philadelphia. Here, Reggie would curate dance with local choreographers and dance groups at 3 historic churches in Center City: St. Peter's Episcopal Church, Old Pine Church, and Mother Bethel A.M.E. Church. And he would also choreograph Fist and Heel in performance at the Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia. The project, ultimately titled Grounds That Shout and Others Merely Shaking, was meant to explore individual and personal relationships between religion, movement, race, place, and the body, and to foreground how the histories of contemporary performance are intertwined with the legacies of African-American religious and religiously affiliated spaces. Harry asked me if the CEE could be involved in some way, and I thought that the graduate students who form CAMERA, which is the Collective for Advancing Multimodal Research Arts, could document the project, giving a broader public access to moments in the discovery process between Reggie and the local choreographers, as well as the culminating event itself, which entailed a procession from site to site. The CEE and CAMERA were thus brought into the process of bearing witness to Reggie's process, to document the development of movement, the relationships between performers and space, the city and its denizens. Because Reggie works through the rubric of what he calls kinesthetic anthropology, we stayed in touch after his Philadelphia residency ended, and I invited him to spend a semester with us as a fellow, which is what happened this past semester. We team taught a course called Kinesthetic Anthropology to a group of 11 students from the School of Arts and Sciences, the Annenberg School for Communication, the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, the Perlman School of Medicine, and the Graduate School of Education. Throughout the semester, we investigated forms of contemporary performance in relation to Africanist forms and functions of dance, movement, and action. We were concerned with how the body knows, with the specificities of time and place, and with what people are doing when they're dancing. We were interested in training ourselves to recognize the cultural values, social purposes, and choreographic innovations embedded in bodily action and motion. We did this through scholarship and film, and also through conversations with a number of visitors, including Jawole, as well as many other performers, both locally based, like Tina Isaac and Jermaine Ingram, and those further afield, like Nalisiwe Skaba. And it was phenomenal. Let me share with you what some of the students wrote when I asked them about their experience. Justina wrote, in a world of screens, we were still able to build a space of beautiful vulnerability and community through movement. I've learned about myself and my body in this class, and I'm able to receive and respond to information in what feels like a new dimension. Working with Reggie has been a true privilege, Jake wrote, especially the chance to see things from his perspective as master choreographer. He showed so much care and guidance as we each found our way to a shared movement. This was a special blessing in a year when we've been isolated from one another and have all experienced so much pain and discomfort. To move with Reggie was a healing experience. And Whitney, who has just completed her medical training, wrote, Monday afternoon classes were a highlight of the past few months. I welcomed the challenge to think and learn outside of my discipline. More importantly, Reggie's constant exhortation to really see and experience bodies and their movement, and to move and feel and learn with my own body will stay with me for a long time and have already begun to increase my perceptiveness and insights as a clinician in training. Indeed, I think we will all repeat Reggie's mantra for thinking choreographically in a fist and heel kind of way, right? Time, space, movement. So let me open our discussion today by formally introducing Reggie. Reggie Wilson calls his fist and heel performance group a post-African neo-hoodoo modern dance company. The company was established in 1989 after Reggie's graduation from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. And Reggie has traveled extensively throughout the Mississippi Delta, Trinidad and Tobago, and Southern, Central, and East Africa, everywhere building relationships through which he would learn about the secular and sacred forms of movement and performance. Fist and Heel has presented the distillations of Reggie's research nationally and internationally at venues such as the Brooklyn Academy of Music, New York Live Arts, Fringe Arts World, Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Myrna Loy, the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans, the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, Dance Factory in South Africa, Dances na Cidade in Portugal, the Festival K-Fek in Senegal, and many other locations. Reggie has also lectured and conducted workshops and community projects throughout the US, Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean, and has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including a McKnight Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Bessie New York Dance and Performance Award, a Herb Alpert Award in Dance, a Doris Duke Performing Artist Award, and a United States Artist Prudential Fellow. We are lucky to have been able to learn from him this semester, and I was particularly thrilled to come back to my own dancing body, in a matter of speaking, and to remember that knowing in an embodied way is also a practice one comes to take for granted. So I've really reveled in watching the students begin to learn to know in this way, in part because it makes me remember how I did. So today we are featuring Reggie in dialogue with colleagues whom I will briefly introduce in a moment. They, like you, have watched the Grounds That Shout film, and they will offer some reflections on it. And if you haven't had the opportunity to watch the film yet, it will be available through tomorrow, and you will have received the link and the password when you registered for this event. After we hear from Jasmine, John, and Jawole, Reggie will respond to their reflections, and then we will have a more free-flowing conversation, which will also open up to questions from you in the audience. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any point during the event. The chat will also be open for you to communicate with us and with each other, but questions will be read from the Q&A section, okay? All right, let me briefly introduce the panel. Jasmine Elizabeth Johnson is an assistant professor of Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. A Ford Foundation Diversity Pre- and Postdoctoral Fellow, she earned her PhD in African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley. Johnson's work examines the politics of Black movement, including dance, diasporic travel, and gentrification. Interdisciplinary in nature, her scholarship and teaching are situated at the intersection of diaspora theory, dance and performance studies, ethnography, and Black feminism. Her first book manuscript, Rhythm Nation, West African Dance and the Politics of Diaspora, will be released not too long from now from Oxford University Press. And her second book project is A Cultural History of Black American Dance. Johnson serves on the founding board for the Collegium for African Diasporic Dance and on the Dance Studies Association Board of Directors. And in 2016, she was awarded the Michael L. Walzer 56 Award from Brandeis University for combining, quote, superlative scholarship with inspired teaching, end quote. I should say that Jasmine is also a professional dancer and has performed internationally. John L. Jackson Jr. is the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and the Richard Perry University Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and Communication. Jackson is the author of Harlem World, Doing Race and Class in Contemporary Black America, Real Black, Adventures in Racial Sincerity, Racial Paranoia, The Unintended Consequences of Political Correctness, Thin Description, Ethnography in the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, Impolite Conversations on Race, Politics, Sex, Money, and Religion with Cora Daniels, and Televised Redemption, Black Religious Media and Racial Empowerment with Carolyn Rouse and Marla Frederick. John is also a filmmaker, and his most recent film, Making Sweet Tea, The Lives and Loves of Southern Black Gay Men, which he co-directed with Nora Gross and co-executive produced with E. Patrick Johnson, has just been picked up for distribution. Finally, Jawole Zollar is my former boss. She is the chief visioning partner of Urban Bush Women, a company she founded in 1984 as a performance ensemble committed to using art as a means for addressing issues of social justice and encouraging civic engagement, and that brings the untold stories of disenfranchised people to light through dance from a woman-centered perspective and as members of the African diaspora community. In addition to the 34 works Jawole has choreographed for the company, she has also created works for the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, Philadelphia, the University of Maryland, Virginia Commonwealth University, and others. She has received Bessie New York Dance and Performance Awards for her work as a choreographer. She was designated Master of Choreographer by the John F. Kennedy Performing Arts Center in 2005. The company has toured 5 continents, and indeed, when I was in the company, we were on the road 35 weeks out of the year. I think that schedule has gotten a little more livable in recent years. And UBW has performed at venues including Lincoln Center, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the Kennedy Center. Jawole is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, also including a Guggenheim, the Doris Duke Performing Artist Award, and a Bessie Lifetime Achievement Award. When Jawole came to our class, I introduced her by telling the students everything she taught us and what dancing with the company was like. And I won't repeat that all here, except to say that I learned from both her artistry and her institution building skills. And I'm so grateful to have her joining us here today. All right, last few words before we get the ball rolling. I want to briefly acknowledge and thank those who made this event possible. Elisa Jordan, our CEE Postdoctoral Fellow, Grace Ndishu, our Administrative Fellow in Community Liaison, and Chris Pasanante and Samuel Rossi from SAS Multimedia Services, who have made this platform possible. Okay, Jasmine, maybe you could start us off.
Happy to. Good afternoon and happy Saturday, everyone. I'm really honored to be here Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for the framing and introduction and for just consistently holding space in such generative ways. I certainly want to thank all those who made Grounds That Shout possible, and also to my fellow panelists. And it's quite an honor to be in conversation with them, and I'm really excited about this work today. I worried that at the end of the semester, clarity might not be best served unless I prepared some remarks. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of read some of the things that came up for me when I was watching and rewatching the film. I'll say that there are a number of considerations that cropped up while watching Grounds That Shout, but in the service of offering quick remarks, I want to anchor my brief comments around the simultaneity of past and present in the film and the various iterations of grounding that seem to suggest a kind of imperative of being with the dead or the past in order to access or ready for a certain kind of capacious possibility for the now. There's a moment in the film where a map is drawn, and it's a design of the procession that charts the flow of the performance's collaborative effort. Quote, May from St. Peter's Episcopal Church to Leela at Old Pine Street Church to Almanac to Tanya at Mother Bethel, end quote. And this moment, seeing the segments come together, moving Black and non-Black bodies through what were predominantly Black neighborhoods, points to the relationship between choreography and cartography, or rather, dance's capacity to remap, activate space, and imbue it with meanings that are in reverent relationship to the past. The collaborative practices inside Grounds That Shout in some ways refuse the protocols of urban renewal itself, what with the latter's emphasis on partition, eviction, and strategic rebranding. In the film, there is a conjuring made possible through an invitation to be with the movers, performers, and shakers, an invitation to situate yourself in relationship to them, which is to also say to history. Indeed, in Grounds That Shout, regard seems to function as its own collaborative partner. And the film captures many iterations of evocation, invocation, glory, and worship, practiced by what Lila Aisha Jones beautifully describes as the in-between people, those somewhere in relation to what she says as, quote, angels and ancestors, recognizing the connections between the sites of performance and their close acquaintance with slavery in Philadelphia. The collaboration seems to raise questions about the afterlives of slavery without a compulsion to flatten, spectacularize, or answer. And this, of course, feels intimately connected to Reggie's own language of, quote, walking on dead people, which is perhaps the very foundation of Shouting Grounds, and also that which resonates in particularly strong ways in Philadelphia, where murals and bronze pillars reminds pedestrians that more Black folks used to be in the very spot that the viewer is now standing. The choice in the film of short way or long way offered a kind of option that required participants to call to the response and not move through absolved or passively. And in the film, where Ben Greenberg shares that there is something about the moment right now that feels connected to 1842, Reggie asks with heavy doses of humor and also important sobriety, really. And I love this moment in the film because it was where I was really at, kind of at the first shot of seeing people talking, hollering, dancing inside cemetery. Simply being there is not the same as being with, after all. And one has to be literate in some ways to hear the ground shout, or physically available enough to shake the ground oneself. I should also say that there was something really useful for me about the kind of collaboration constituting a little bit more of the film than the performances themselves, to be able to see the making of what Reggie described as, quote, a container that can stay fuzzy in the performance, end quote. And I really appreciated the ways collaboration held and holds out an imperfect possibility for decentered partnership visioning, and communion. I'll end these quick remarks with a scene of the incredible Jermaine Ingram moving through and circling inside of a chamber. She eventually rests in a black chair. Her body in convulsion, she comes to standing, uttering reiteratively, "I'm so happy." She jumps, hands stretched down, palms flexed. Her arm eventually raises. She says, "My soul is so happy." And the jumping then decelerates, sends her back inside and around the circle that has formed in this space. Some kind of wind instrument begins to play. And I think she is saying, I've played it back a number of times, but I think she is saying, "Rock my soul." The word soul protracted like stretched taffy as she exits the space, left fist raised and bicep flexed. In this stunning moment, I was reminded of Thomas de France, who has written that, quote, "The diaspora enlivens us and simultaneously reminds us to mourn. Its ubiquity constantly turns us toward death and points to the ways in which Black cultural forms have hosted and even cultivated a dynamic rapport with the presence of death," end quote. In this moment, and so many more in the film, this rapport with death felt like possibility rather than a proscriptive limit or constraint. The ground, after all, is a noisy mooring. Consequently, Grounds That Shout invites us into the possibility of choreography as a practice of being and a practice of life. Choreography as a conferral rather than an arrival. I will end there, and maybe I will pass it to Dean Jackson.
Thanks for those beautiful comments, actually, on a powerful and beautiful film as well. I probably should have taken your sort of lead and written something out, but I feel like there was a version of my response to the film that almost didn't allow me the time to think about kind of how to put things down on paper, because there's so much about, I think, what I found so demonstrably important about what this film tries to give us that I thought it might be useful as I was here to kind of think through three very specific topics that for me, the film reinforced in really powerful ways. The first one I think connects a little bit to the tension that you laid out, Jasmine, between past and present in the film and how it thinks through and theorizes temporality in this really interesting way. And part of what it leads me to emphasize, at least the first of 3 points, is a version of what ethnomusicologist and anthropologist Stephen Feld termed acoustomological concerns. And by acoustomology, for the folks who don't know the term, is simply a way of talking about maybe two different things at one and the same time. One is the extent to which our understanding of the world is always already, at least in some significant component, about our capacity to hear it, right? So it's understanding the world we live in, the social landscape, not simply by what we see or feel or touch, but also there's a version of what we hear that explains something important to us about the world we inhabit, about what constitutes it, about how people navigate it. But the second part of this notion of acoustomology that I think is really important that often gets left out is it's a decidedly relational term. So it's about the connections between the interesting kinds of comminglings of different elements in a specific space. For the film, it was this powerful, I thought, relationship between what we were hearing and what the bodies were doing. Of course, in any film, for a filmmaker, and I come at this as a filmmaker, you realize often people underestimate the significance of sound for telling what we imagine to be visual stories. And that's the role of the acoustomological, of the sounds, of the music, right? Music from different genres, music that clearly helps us to understand what the choreographers are trying to do with these bodies in situ in the various spaces that they occupy. But also the sound of the conversations, the really powerful discussions between and among the dancers themselves, the choreographers themselves, trying to figure out how to put together a project that in most of these instances were clearly group and collective enterprises in every way, right? From the conceptualization all the way down to the execution. What stood out to me also in listening to those discussions, to those framings and reframings and negotiations around how you navigate a given space, the specificities of a given space in this film, was that there was always a kind of intrinsic, inescapable intellectuality to this notion of being embodied, to the ways in which these choreographers and these dancers were trying to find a way to articulate profound, important, maybe even ephemeral and hard to grasp concepts in the kinds of ways in which they framed for themselves and for us as folks able to eavesdrop via the camera, all the different kinds of things that were important for them as they thought through the decisions they had about what to do to make the space interact, to relate with the performances in ways that gave it added power and its significance. So I thought that was really important. The second thing that for me was really valuable to come back to in watching the film, especially the second time, was just how important not just sound is, acoustomology, all the things we hear to help us understand what we're ostensibly seeing, but also just how specific every single space's demands were of the artists and intellectuals who are trying to use that space to say things about diaspora, about race, about the past. And for a filmmaker, often one of the things you learn to do, especially in kind of the traditional notion of filmmaking, is you recognize that every single space you occupy when you're shooting a film has its own sound. And so, sound recorders would always slow us down at the end of a shoot because they wanted to get what we used to call room tone. And the idea was you wanted to make sure you understand what the space sounds like when no one's talking, because you will need some of that sound to do the kind of editing work that you do. And so the other thing that was really important, besides recognizing just how masterfully each one of these spaces were occupied and re-energized by the decisions the performers and the choreographers made, was just how distinctive these spaces were and allowed the choreographers to be, to try to figure out how to squeeze out of those particular locations what they imagine the audiences could grasp and hold on to and take back with them as folks trying in some ways to be sanctified by what was really, I think, powerful and impressive attempts to use the body to re-energize, unlearn, and then re-signify these spatial locations in ways that I thought were really valuable. And then I think the third and final thing I'll say is, it struck me that in every one of these instances, one of the things you can't help but miss, at least as an American audience member in 2021, thinking about the issues that seem to undergird the kinds of projects that these presentations, that these performances worked in service to, was that these were examples of decidedly multiracial endeavors, right? Attempts to think about, I would argue, decidedly maybe diasporic histories, African-American histories, and political possibilities, but in the context of discussions across a lot of lines and forms of difference. That, for me, was a really good example of the distinction one should and can make in the contemporary moment between what we might imagine to be post-racial possibility and post-racial community and collectivity, and the imaginings, the fantasies, we might even argue, folks offer up about post-raciality. And one of the things that struck me about, and I'll end on this note, all of the ways in which this film tries to tell the story of the complex and multi-pronged efforts that went into inhabiting not just the individual spaces, but all these iconic spiritual locations across the city, was that it was a demonstration of just how important it is to recognize that even if we're thinking about a world where we're working together across forms of difference, sometimes highly political, sometimes incredibly cathected and problematic, given the history of race in this country, that there's a way to do it that doesn't allow itself to be predicated on the assumption that the only way to think across racial terms is to deny the reality of racialized histories, that kind of past that Jasmine highlighted as one of the things that seemed to be central as a kind of framing device for, I think, what the film and the performances that the film tries to depict was able to really bring home quite forcefully. And so it was a powerful piece. I keep thinking about it. We'll continue to work through it. Glad to be here with you all today and looking forward to the rest of the conversation. And I will pass it on now to Jawole.
Well, I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for this opportunity to really offer reflections on this beautiful work. And I'm also going to offer reflections on kind of a larger framing of my relationship to Reggie's work as well. I did not prepare remarks. I tend to not do that. I'm going to let my body speak as it did when I experienced the film. I experienced the film through my body, viscerally. Those places where this thing happens that's so conjured so beautifully in the film. One of the things that I thought about was the power of circles, and in particular concentric circles. So I thought about how this process started with Reggie as this conceiver person really offering a vision of something, and then how it moved out into another ring, and then how it moved out into another ring, and how it moved out into another ring and a larger ring and a larger ring. And what I think the power of the film captures, and I think it also in Reggie's work, is that as this moves out and expands and breathes, in these multiple sites, it retained its intimacy, and I think that is because of the specificity that Reggie brought to the work by listening and honoring the places of the sites that they were on, the sites of the body, the listening to the people who were bringing forth their movement magic. So I just started just thinking about generosity, the generosity of these circles that move out and out and out and out until we come to procession, which is like a river. It's like a river. So we're circling lines and how these things come together. And in that circle and lines coming together, it made me think of the Congo cosmogram, 4 moments of the sun, that the past, present, and really future, or we existed once. And that the idea that that it's separated is kind of a false construct. And in the way that the ancestral acknowledgement, listening, presence with that which is in the moment, in the realm of the now, and then what will to be, how we understand what will to be, that is the power, I think, of the vision of this work of the film. And I was thinking about that when I got to see the work at St. Mark's Dance Space early on. I believe maybe in its early life. And then I started thinking about even beyond that when I first saw Reggie's work. And you feel that ground, moving up underneath you. You feel that ground shaking. You feel that the speaking, the listening. And I think what's extraordinary in the film is that speaking and listening is operating again on multiple levels. I learned this new word, acoustum. I'm not going to even try to pronounce it, but I was so struck by that word because the sound, even in the silence, the sound, the listening, the hearing, the stomping, the moving, the whew, the shouting in its multiple manifestations. That space with Jermaine will just stay in my body. That will just stay vibrating vibrating with me. So, I'm looking at these conversations between, this, what starts with us is the individual thinking, I have an idea of something, and how it moves out. And then the brilliance, I think, of the film, and again of Reggie, is the specificity. So that it's not just we're at this place and we're at this place and now we're going to do something, the term site specific or site responsive, but it's more in relationship to the architecture often. And this is in relationship to the history of those that are with us, but maybe we don't know, or some of us experience them being with us, but maybe not seen. That the power of this film for me conjured conjured this demand to be present, to listen, to the history of the grounds as it's literally rising up and coming down and coming in. And what that then, when you have the brilliance of collaboration and the brilliance of Reggie's vision that turns into visions with other people, what, just for me, it's like this is what it feels like in my body, that it's a constant regeneration, it's a constant motion, it's a constant moving, and it's like going from my head through my chest to my pelvis, and it's a constant vibration of listening and experiencing and witnessing and breathing in uh, this brilliance. And I want to say the last thing about the procession. I think when the first time when I'd read about processions, but I didn't grow up in a community where I experienced processions, except maybe at funerals, just just a little bit, but not really. So when I first went to New Orleans and I really experienced processional theater dance experiences, um, I, I knew that there was something that was just the circles and lines. And thinking about the festival in Philadelphia, the procession to the river, and the power of communities that operate both in these circular forms and then in these forms that are like the river, they flow. So the processions for me also located again the specificity of this is where I am placed, this is where I am moving, and that becomes the futuring. This is where I am going to, this is what is around me, this is where I have been. So I just want to thank everyone again for the gift of this film, and Reggie for the for the time span of your vision, that this is captured, that this is a moment in time, this film, this, but it's the largeness of your vision is captured, so that others can really share an experience. So thank you. And I am passing it back to, I forgot, to Deborah.
Yeah, to everybody, John, Jasmine, Reggie, you can come back on. And Reggie, you do you want to offer some response now, or do you want to meditate with the words a little more and I can draw some questions out, or what would you like to do? I think you're muted.
I have 16,000 thoughts and responses, and I'm thinking through a bunch of them. That was just so appreciated. I'd like to grab books, and so just there's so many things where it's a. Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to say just like the invitation, like I like to stick stuff in people's face. I don't know if they can see that, but dancing platform, praying grounds, Blackness churches in downtown. Dance is the catalog from the New York platform that Judy at Dance Space first invited me in to work with. And then y'all can see that Grounds and Shout. This was the booklet, little pamphlet that we gave out for Grounds and Shout in Philadelphia. So working with Dee on the film and thinking about the many different ways that we could kind of approach this film, this documentary, this sharing. I feel, I wrote it, I tried to write it down. I feel seen and I feel heard in the thought of what dance can do, what action can do, what movement can do, and what thinking through action and movement and organizing it, as John said, intellectually, what trusting in that and believing in that things can rise up and share out, and things that I feel like I didn't, because I haven't talked to you guys about it, that you kind of saw. So that to me is a wonderful thing. I had another reaction. I don't know if I'm gonna do it because I picked up this little fan that was part of the procession, one of the handouts, little things that we did. But if I have a second. With my heart full of sorrow and my eyes full of tears, Lord, I just can't keep on crying. So just going back and thinking about those things that I used to, as a child growing up, exposed to practices, used to laugh at, make fun of, not understand, to be able to have gone from that to my own personal exploration and my own struggle and processing, to kind of still be centered in that and to share that out in a way that it is meaningful and powerful and validating. It feels validating to me, it feels validating to my family in Milwaukee and the church that I grew up in, and the practices and the experiences down from Arkansas, from Phillips County, Arkansas, from Marvel, Arkansas, from the Delta, and then taking that to all of our experiences and having it be able to have meaning and be meaningful and be on a global stage for analysis, for articulation, and for recognition of the power of that. And like Jawole, this term, I was gonna say John, but Mr. Jackson, Dean Jackson, acoustomological.
Yes,
I got me a new word now. No, I got acoustomological is like that sound. And so I think this idea of how dance and vibration come together and the power and the meaning of that in a global sense is really powerful. And in the decision and the discussions that Dee and I had about all this footage and how to communicate it and to trust and to go back to centralizing the choice making, the decision making, the dance making. What are the actions? How do people get to making actions? How do we start to determine what is it we are doing when we're dancing? And how can we come up with systems and structures that are legible to a viewer, even if they don't know how they know what's going on, but they get a sense of a connection. And it does have to do with that kind of human sensibility of being able to connect sound to vibration and body as a creator of vibration, as well as a manifestation of vibration. So that's my current response.
Yeah. I just want to let people know that when Reggie is saying Dee, he's talking about Gordon Divine Diasa, who is a graduate student here in the Graduate School of Education and who was the director of camera in the year that this project was happening. So he coordinated the shoot, directed and produced the film, and edited with Reggie in a really interesting, I think, collaborative way. So I just wanted to let people know that. And also, you know, I want to pick up on a couple points that you all raised. And, you know, one has to do with the specificity of place. And of course, this is something we talked about a lot in the class, and that emerged, as you all noted, as so paramount in the project itself, right? The specific places of the churches and the histories, the specific histories of those places, and how those histories speak to the broader histories of African Americans, you know, what the Philadelphia story is as part of that broader story, which is also a diasporic story. So those kinds of diasporic places, like how do we think diaspora if we're not thinking about that big extended geographic circle? You know, how can we read diaspora also in these specific places? How do we see Haiti, Jamaica, and African America within like one church structure, you know, both historically and in terms of present congregations? And also, Jawole raised the question of intimacy, that you know, we maintain a sense of intimacy in some ways because of the specificity of the place and of the kinds of vibrations that that place gives to us and transmits to us, not only in being there, you know, in being on the ground that shouts, but also in then observing, you know, observing it through this kind of visual mode. And, you know, she raised the question then of the project and the film being a kind of form of witnessing and of listening. And I wondered, Reggie, if you could talk a little bit about what that process was for you, like what you heard differently in listening to these different spaces in Philadelphia.
Well, I mean, there's I got maybe not 16,000, but maybe like 40 thoughts now about thinking about what trying to figure out what it was we were going to do, what it was we were trying to do. And the idea that we were starting off with something that had happened in New York at St. Mark's Church, and all of the choreographers came and performed and dealt with the history and the legacy and the experiences and their reactions to the architecture of St. Mark's Church. Like, and that relationship of St. Mark's Church and dance space to the postmodern contemporary dance field, right? And then coming to Philadelphia and having a really different expression and experience of contemporary dance, like what contemporary dance in Philadelphia is, or what dance is in Philadelphia, is very different than New York. So that was one pot of information. Another pot of information was through another project I'd done in Philadelphia with Jermaine Ingram, her turning me on to Mother Rebecca Cox Jackson and her Shaker community, Black Shaker, what the Shakers in the Shaker world you call an out Shaker community. It hadn't come in full alignment with all Shaker protocol, but thinking about what their shout traditions and prayer traditions were, and thinking about Black folks and Shakerism. And because I always run into these places where it seems like Black folks have been excluded or aren't part of or haven't participated in. And it's just like, wait, what a minute, wait, what? There was a bunch of Black women in Philadelphia that had their own kind of like theology, and then they ran into the Shakers up in Watervliet, and then they went back to Philadelphia, and then the Philadelphia community lasted until the 20th century. It was also in, come on, Reggie, come on, the Philadelphia Negro, whose sociological study is that?
E.B. Du Bois.
Du Bois. And so that started to crack open, and then just learning about Black folks in Philadelphia, and Mother Rebecca being a free person of color, but being illiterate and praying herself literate, So then it's just like, okay, so all those two kind of like disparate ideas, right? Like, how does that experience come to be something in Philadelphia that's actually meaningful to Philadelphia? And which sanctuaries are we going to go to? Different temples? Are we going to go to places that maybe held some meetings but aren't really religious sites? Like, and we just the logistics of like concentrating it down. We ended up more in Center City, but I was still fascinated by Church of the Advocate and their particular history in, come on, is that North Philadelphia? My brain is gone. That was a while ago.
Yep, no.
How, what was going on there with the Black Panthers, and what was going on there with um, what do you call it? No words in my mouth. Um, Ordaining the first female priest, and then ordaining the first Black female bishop, like that, and the just the space is phenomenal. So we just had to make strategic plans to kind of like get to that. And then I did want a group of choreographers like we had in New York, thinking about Blackness in its largest possible way, but not just having Black dancers and Black folks um, thinking through that, but forcing, as my experience in New York, you know, a lot of white folks in the dance world haven't been pulled into having to think about their relationship to that. And this group of folks, the postmoderns in New York, in the Judson Dance Theater and the Great Union, hadn't really thought about it then. Some of them have started to think about it now. So I wanted to pull that also into Philadelphia's really different history and the really different aesthetics, and to try and paint as broad of a picture with a limited budget and a limited space, and then really go into, and then Ariel Julia Brown we hired as dramaturgy, and she drafted this like gigantic, it wasn't gigantic, but we did go from like,
It's gigantic.
from the Ice Age to the current, just like overarching like the histories of Philadelphia and Black folks, but also other, you know, the what did I used to call them, the recent white folks, so the immigrants that came over that became white after World War II or slightly before that, thinking about native land rights, not just rights, but being here, and what is that culture? What was those relationships? Thinking about not just the Jamaica Day riots, which is kind of one of the Almanac Dance Theater focused on, thinking about how people were moving back and forth to different regions, to different areas, to different continents, and how that information landed back, and were there actual connections to the actual sites, who had walked out of a church, who had started their own new church, and what were those relationships between those communities. Then also relating to the congregations and the leadership, and their being in proximity to each other, but their desire to want to talk to each other, but the difficulty about talking to each other, just the logistics of finding time. Mm-hmm. So all of that got pulled into the mix of trying to streamline into something that could be a processional performance, and then at Church of the Advocate be a kind of more condensed stationary performance, but actually within that gigantic church having a procession and having the audience kind of shift spaces. So this idea, as Jawole brought up, my longtime lighting designer collaborator, Jonathan Belcher, had brought up early in my career, it's just like, you know, all your pieces are circles and lines. And to know that I'm still looking at circles and lines, and then going back, and I see how important circles and lines are in so many different earth-based performances. So that kind of answer your...
Yeah, you answered me, and you also answered Susan Manning, who had posted a question about the differences between the New York and the Philadelphia iterations of the project. And Susan had said that it seems like the Philadelphia project embedded more deeply into the community than the New York project. And I think that's right. I think that in working with the different choreographers and really digging into, so to speak, the histories of the church grounds in where you were working, it necessarily sort of pulled you into these really, I'm endlessly fascinated by the kind of overlapping imperial histories of Philadelphia. And I tell my students this all the time. I'm sure they're sick of hearing it if any of them are here, but that, Philadelphia was actually a land grant given to William Penn as compensation for his father having taken Jamaica for the British Crown. So in that early Atlantic Worlds moment, Philly was like the place they were kicking out not only the dissident Quaker, William Penn, but also the son of the imperialist, which was, of course, at the time, any family of means would have had connections not only to imperialism, but also to the slave trade. But so that the overseas imperialism is so entangled with the settler colonialism and these weird histories of, Philadelphia as the center really of the emergent revolutionary nation state. I think that all of those histories are so embedded in this landscape, and I think we probably felt that too, Jawole, when we did that community engagement project eons ago in Philadelphia. And I'm sure that must have been what was sort of driving your questioning, Reggie, and in trying to understand what kinds of grounds these were, right? That's what's sort of shaping part of your imagination during that time.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, okay. So I wanted to just pick up on a couple other things before opening up to everybody. And remember, you can put questions in the Q&A. One of the things that I thought was interesting was this point that John made in teaching everybody the new word, acoustomological, about sound and the importance of a sonic experience in the film. And also Jawole pointed out as like the vibrations that she was receiving in her body from the film. And I think that was super interesting because it made me wonder if there's something about, and anybody can speak to this, it doesn't necessarily have to be Reggie, but if there's something about Reggie's process with place that makes film, usually understood as a visual medium, somehow transcend that limitation and become something that's experienced through sound, through the haptic, touch, or the body, or the vibration. Like, is it something about the editing? Is it something about the process of making the pieces and documenting that process that allows this visual medium to transcend its own limitations? Do you understand what I'm saying? I just thought it was really interesting that all three of you in different ways kind of raised these other sensory dimensions beyond the visual, and I just wondered why that is. Like, what is it that prompted us to receive this particular filmic offering in that way?
I'll jump in, I guess, to start. I'm not sure. I do think part of my point, though, is to say that any serious filmmaker, whether it's popular pulp film or sort of film artists who imagine themselves to be auteurs and they're thinking, even theorizing in images, I think they all recognize that, post-silent film, and even during the silent film era, sound was important. And it helped to drive the story along. I think if there's anything about this film that strikes me as particularly susceptible to the audience recognizing the value of the sonic, it's because there's so much of this film that's us watching bodies move in space and realizing that what we hear when they do it in every situation is so distinctive, right? It's marked so differently. And even from the rehearsals to the actual performances, and I think there's something about how we can register the subtle distinctiveness of the soundings in the space, because we're just watching the bodies work, and we're watching them sort of work through the choreography, thinking about how to reimagine the space, that I think because we're not distracted by a more traditional sense of narrativity, right? We're not following these two characters that go into the store and buy the latte and then they get, run over by, like we're situated in the story in a way that I think demands we recognize the power of what we're hearing as really helping to propel in really, I think, powerful ways what the filmmakers and the artists are trying to capture. And a lot of it, I do think, is almost also about, and I'll stop here, on a kind of incongruity or discomfort. Like there were some moments that to me felt really uncomfortable in the film. But maybe, and that was a question I was gonna ask Reggie about. So I remember there was a space when they're dancing, the sound is amazing and the singing is so powerful in a couple of these moments in particular. Maybe I'll just do one of the scenes. It's the moment towards the end, where clearly it's almost like this sort of liturgical dance ministry where the women are dancing in the aisle and up top, and it's a mostly, if not even exclusively white congregation. And at least my interpretation of the faces of those white congregants was almost like shocking. Like they didn't know what was going on. And some folks were like, look, some folks weren't even watching the dancing, right? They were looking down at the program. And I think there's a version of that to me is an example of how we're knitting together the visual, the sonic, the haptic, and in those moments, it almost felt uncomfortable to have those things sort of brush up against one another in that particular space with that audience across the chasms of difference and maybe even differences in religious and spiritual upbringing and assumptions. But I do think it was about just how much we have to sit and watch the audience, watch them or not watch them, and listen to it, that I think allows us to recognize there's so much we can squeeze out of what this means that's a function of what we're hearing, and then how that maps onto what we think the images are showing us.
Can I say something? Yeah, so that was Tanya Isaacs and her work at Mother Bethel and working with the praise and dance ministry at Mother Bethel. And their deep, deep, deep work that they had already been doing, and for them to come together with Tanya with this really contemporary postmodern experimental, weird, kind of engagement, but mutual respect, and they continue to kind of like engage with each other in different moments. And one thing that was, so it was an audience, it wasn't a congregation, which are these nice, interesting lines that we're also kind of exploring in the different sites. Was thinking about, and there were 3 performances, each for that procession, there were 3 performances that followed each other, maybe separated by maybe about an hour or hour and a half from each other. So the one where Dee and the crew were there to film that was actually the smallest and the whitest group. And I was just like, oh, we need, where it was fuller and a lot more Black faces in there. But that tension between who's dancing, who's looking, who's watching each other, and the way Tanya kind of like, she wanted it not to be her space as a choreographer coming in, that she wanted this to be recognized, and the choices she made as choreographer, right? To show that this was a space that had a history, it had bodies and people, and so she wanted them in the aisles and them dancing, and then the kind of hip-hoppy, loud kind of music comes on through the beautiful sound system that they have in Mother Bethel. And then up in the balcony, there's the vocals coming. So they didn't know which direction stuff was gonna hit them from. And also, it's contemporary, experimental, postmodern, whatever kind of word you want to tack onto it. So people are getting out of their comfort zone. I think whether they were walking on the church grounds or through the cemeteries, or whether they were in Old Pines Sanctuary and seeing all of the filigree and the stuff, and here comes Layla traipsing over the pews and dressed like, I call it a haint, dressed, with this veil over her, but representing and all the African kind of Congo or Deep South kind of images that are conjured up with that. So the uncomfortableness, it wasn't just about, oh yeah, that's groovy, yeah, oh, that's pretty. It's just like, what is going on? Oh, here's a different way of looking at movement. Here's a different way or different relationship of movement and sound. One is causal, one is juxtaposition, and then there are multiple other ones. And I just really, during the process, wanted to give the choreographers, which I think is why we kept coming back to the choreographers for this film, the opportunity to see how their individual choice making, how they tackled that. What was their process to tackle this site, this congregation, this leadership, this navigation of the piece needs to be this so long and the audience has to come in and they have to go out. So yeah, that's.
Yeah. Right. So I want to raise one other point before opening it up, which has to do with the circles and the Congo cosmogram and Jasmine's idea of choreography as cartography, or the relationship between choreography and cartography, and that kind of remapping that happened with the different choreographers' work in the spaces. And I guess I just want to sort of open that up for sort of a more general discussion, because I think it's part of the obsession also with the Congolese-based traditions that we see across the diaspora, about which we spoke at length during the class across the whole semester. But also, you know, that idea that you talk about all the time, Reggie, in terms of fractals, which made me think about the circles upon circles upon circles, right? There's the circle of the, you know, hip, and then there's the circle of the actual group of people doing, you know, the shout, and then there's the circles of community into which people move, you know, through them. And then there are the circles of community through which you moved here in Philadelphia and bringing the different people in. And I wanted to know, like, what, you know, what you take away from that now, like how did Philadelphia remap these things for you? And in what ways do you think these sort of ever expanding circles continue to sort of bring new people, new ideas, new themes, new practices into your own sort of choreographic language, your own historical thinking, your own sense of community?
The fractal thing is something that's really groovy to me, and thinking about fractals. And one of the sources or books that we assigned and worked from was Ron Eglish's book, African Fractals. And thinking about, he's an ethnomathematician, and thinking about how ubiquitous, don't necessarily call it fractals, but this idea of scaling, working in, even if it's a limited space, working infinitely smaller, infinitely larger, and being able to scale up and scale down infinitely, being a really amazing organizing tool to use choreographically, to use socially, to use. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving. And it pops up in places. And so also this idea of self-generating or self-replicating systems. And so it gives you the ability to kind of infinitely scale up and scale down without having to like control every single inch of the thing as long as certain aspects are kind of consistent. So I don't know, and I never know, and I'm not that kind of scholar that I try and track down and cite and source every original idea that I still hold on to. I still take that liberty as an artist, as a choreographer, to kind of be like, well, I don't know where that came from, and I want to do whatever I want to do, but to still try and be respectful and in relationship with. And so being able to have what was that New York group of artists who I knew, some more, some less, but thinking about the space and what that space meant to contemporary dance or experimental dance or postmodern dance in downtown New York or downtown dance. But thinking in Philadelphia that I had this relationship with Jermaine, Jermaine Ingram, this relationship with David, my best friend who I've known since I was 16, whose last name I can't remember right now.
Rick.
David Brick. And bringing them in to kind of help consult, and then Philadelphia Contemporary, and then CEE, and then camera under CEE, and then like all of these pockets or systems and being able to relate to them, and each choreographer having its own world and trying to be really specific about what is the task that each choreographer is going in, working with Partners for Sacred Places. Did I get that right? And their history. So the work that Harry and Philadelphia Contemporary and Sam Miller in putting this, launching this kind of like idea in Philadelphia from New York, and then getting the right kind of partners in place that could kind of manage this, and getting the support from Pew, and also the nudging and the documenting that has to happen for a Pew project. All of those systems, being able to coordinate them and have them coordinate, but still try and come up with something so that the choreographers and the choreographic vision and process could be prioritized. And it's, to me, that's my soapbox for the last 5 years or 10 years, is for how I continue to be astonished and amazed by how choreographers, I'll say especially contemporary choreographers, especially contemporary experimental choreographers, I'll try and stop with that, how in their own careers they have engaged with ideas and problem solving. They've engaged with individuals that they have continued to work with or bring in to work with. So their analysis relationship to communities is phenomenal. And I feel like it's an untapped resource, because people either get disoriented, it's like, I don't know what all that dance is about. And dance is supposed to be, you're supposed to snap in a dance, it's not always paralleled in that way. And what humans have done with movement and action is phenomenal. And when I come into relationship with different contemporary choreographers that really have it as their goal to come up with what they're doing with their dancing, there's a whole universe in that. And when you put that universe in the universe of a sacred space, or almost any space, it just grows and grows and grows. And so I feel lucky to ask the right question, to articulate the right thing at the right time, and then hopefully have enough stamina to do the follow through. And to see who is here with us right now, and I'm not talking about the attendees, I'm talking about the talking heads. I'm gonna stop. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to hear Jawole and Jay. We got J and J in here. That I don't know. There's something in that. JJ.
The 3 J's. Yeah.
So.
Do you want? Okay. So I will open it up a little bit. I see Juan has come with a question. I think Jawole's headphones died, so she's putting in something else. or maybe we were about to hear the tractor in her yard. But let me call out Juan's question, and then if anybody else has questions, they can put them in the Q&A. Reggie, Juan, who, as you remember, worked on the film, like did a lot of the shooting, is asking you to talk a bit more about the collaboration with the institutional partners and the historical churches in Philadelphia, and how that collaboration impacted particular aspects of the whole program. You touched on some of that just now, but maybe you could say a bit more.
This was a ridiculously collaborative, complicated project. So I didn't have to cover every aspect of it. And so there were things, being able to work with Partners for Sacred Places, that was their expertise. So we're really lucky to have their expertise is matching artists with religious sites. And so their experience of what kind of religious communities or congregations, what they think about artists. And then with artists, because there's this space idea, right? That there's this open space, and artists often want space, whether they're visual artists or whether they're dancing artists. So being able to share this resource, but being able to match, I forget, see, even they have Karen and the folks at Partner, they have a language of being able to talk about that. So being able to have the experience and the language of how to either translate between genres or communities was really impactful. And then to have Philadelphia Contemporary, even though it was new, but having the experience of knowing who the artists were, what is the art scene, what's the dance scene in Philadelphia, and explicitly thinking about the kind of, I've lost all my adjectives, but thinking about the difference between what that downtown New York scene's work kind of what our fascinations are versus what the contemporary experimental world in Philadelphia, what their obsessions kind of are, and how that plays out slightly different aesthetically. It was interesting to see when the different church leaders would get back to us, how they would get back to us, what their desired relationship was with the community already was, what their race experience either was or wasn't, what type of policies they had put into place or hadn't put into place. The amount of time, because they are, and we don't necessarily think of them that way. There was something that was really interesting to me with both of these projects, the New York one and the Philadelphia one, was thinking about them as volunteer organizations. So much of the dance world is based off of volunteer or cheap labor or just a struggle, just trying to get out there and do it and get the work. And then with churches, how many people are volunteering to be on this committee, to do that? And the economies, how they they're not the same, but they have a lot to learn from each other. So that's, for me, something that was personally valuable, that instead of what's been offered to the contemporary dance, where I think has been this corporate model, is thinking, well, that doesn't really always work. It works for some choreographers, I think, but thinking about what's your relationship to the actual people and the actual community, and how do you get support? How do you get funds? How do you actually get work done? How do you help? How do you pay back? How do you incorporate? How do you educate? How are you educated? Looking at those models seem to be a lot more complementary than thinking of the dance world and the corporate world. I did that at the last minute. I was gonna say corporate, and yeah. So is that?
Yeah, great. I wonder if Jawole or Jasmine or John, the three J's, if you have any questions that you all want to ask Reggie directly.
Or each other.
Or each other.
I'm still kind of absorbing what you just said, Reggie, about the different the different concerns of Philadelphia, what you saw in the different communities, and I would even say within the, I don't know where I'm placed in any of this because I don't know where I am, but like wherever people have placed me, and others that are kind of like with Black postmodern, experimental neo, whatever that is, that it seems that the concerns have mostly been very different, even from in New York, from what was being produced within, I would say, mostly white choreographers, not exclusively, but the concerns were different, a different kind of embodiment, a different kind of relationship with history, um, and a different kind of relationship with urgency. Um, Sometimes I call it running towards the fire while you're on fire. You know, you're full of, when I think of the Judson Church and what was happening in the 60s, and what the Black choreographers, a lot of them at that time, were running towards with the urgency. So I think there's been a dichotomy for a long time that I felt sensed, been confused by, been, you know, different relationships with. So I was really absorbing your articulation of that, um, as you were talking, and then realizing I don't know as much about the Philadelphia, what is there now. Maybe you've known it a little bit more historically. And I think that's again what, um, the power of the work, the power of the film, the power of the communities that were brought together. Um, the New York downtown community, as it was, I never quite felt a part of. Maybe it was some relationship to it, but I also wasn't a relationship to the necessarily the uptown world. And so when these communities can come together, or just notice, maybe that's what I'm absorbing by what you said, the noticing of what we bring to the table and why, and particularly for me, the urgency, the imperative. I was just thinking about Albert Murray, the vernacular imperative that just came to my mind. Um, yeah.
Thanks for that. Yeah. Jasmine, John, do you have anything you want to raise?
I guess maybe you go.
Sure. Okay. Well, there's a lot on my mind, but I was thinking about this one moment in the film where Reggie, you said, let me like pull up my little, you're like, don't trip. Why are you transcribing? It was such a great moment because one of the things I really enjoyed was that like collaboration is incredibly important and so vital, and also not necessarily a romance, right? Like it's imperfect. It requires a lot to happen. And there was something so productive about being able to see all of that, and the ways that there was a certain kind of invitation that at least from my position, viewing it from the outside, didn't seem to be hyper controlled, but seemed like there was a real respect and regard for what each choreographer were bringing, with some kind of awareness that the collaboration would not be inherently neat, because collaboration rarely is. But there was this moment where you said something that was really powerful, and you said this, that what you were doing was about providing opportunities for conversations about what we want to do, which needs to be protected, and also about being able to frame that in a context where we understand the different perceptions and the different impacts of those perceptions on what we're actually doing. And you said we're not in a black box doing absolutely whatever we want, but we're doing what we want in the context of this is actually their space. They go back to that church on Sunday after we finish. And so that was really powerful for me. And I guess I want to advance a question that's about kind of caretaking when the performance ends, because we've talked so much about the kind of the design of it. And I'm wondering, how do you or how did you all kind of collectively exit? Not that that is ever neat or straightforward, but it does seem like it requires its own kind of grace when folks have opened up and been so willing to collaborate, right? Like, how does that collaboration shape or transform maybe when one is exiting the performance rather than entering?
It's complicated. My first thought I wanted to kind of throw out there was that, Jawole, you were to, and when I speak of downtown dance, that to me, and me coming up and coming to New York in 1985, was you. So for me, it wasn't just a certain type or aspect of the downtown dance. And so just to bounce that back, and we can come back to more, you and I can talk more about that, because I just appreciate you being somebody I can always reach out to. Jasmine, to your point, the managing something is complicated. It's not finished. And so I think that was one of the beauties and benefits of working with partners. And like, so it's not just on my plate, or not just on, but it was a shared plate. And so the conversation is continuing with the ability and the meeting and the funds and the resources to make this film, so the conversation can continue. We did have a New York convening of some of the Philadelphia folks came up to New York to meet the New York folks, and so it wasn't all perfect again, but to have those two conversations start to meet in a room and have some of the
remember, Reggie, do you remember the woman, one of the women who had worked with Tanya, said that that was her first time she ever went on the train to go to New York, right? To come to
up for this conversation. And so there were congregants from some of the Philadelphia churches, as well as the artists, and some of the congregants at St. Mark's Church got to see, you know, cross view or cross see each other having their experiences, their own, like, who's this artist, dancer coming in doing the stuff I don't understand in my church? Oh, that was interesting. Oh yeah, you remember so and sister so and they walked out of the church and we had this big thing, and then the whole service got changed, but then, oh, y'all did that too, you know? So like those conversations might be little blips and moments. So that was one convening. Now that this film, and then the pandemic happened, right? So being able, now that the film is complete, we have more opportunities to go back and be like, y'all remember when? And then this kind of, and not everybody got to have the relationship with the congregation or the site that they wanted to have, and vice versa. And that could be for multiple reasons. That could be because of the choice makings of the artist. It could be because of the decisions or protocol or schedules of the leadership, or how the different leadership was structured in the different places. How much staff they had to kind of like facilitate communication and actually receive an email and respond in a time before, you know, oh, we got some funds, we can pay for a congregant or two to come up to this thing in New York. You got to wait till the right Sunday to get it in the bulletin, to make the announcement. Then people, I don't remember what, you know, that, all of that. And because that wasn't the only thing on the plate, right? That doesn't get to be in at one site. And all of these, to me, it was really trying to help facilitate something I was interested in, but trying to listen to, well, what work have you done as a religious site to your community and to your congregation, to be able to go and talk to another congregation, because they're a block and a half away from y'all. I'm coming from New York to facilitate a conversation. Y'all could also continue that. So I don't take on all of that responsibility, but I do, in my own practice, when I work with a community or a place, I do try to get back. Sometimes it's 2 years later, sometimes it's 10 years later, sometimes it's actually maybe 20 years later. But, you know, oh, it's like a Zoom or it's a WhatsApp call. It's just like, hey, happy holidays, or happy whatever your Independence Day was. to kind of make something kind of continue. It doesn't ever stop, so that jumping back and forward in time, the quantum aspect of it, the fractal aspect of it, trying to not just judge myself on a finite timeline, but to stay in the practice and keep the community going. But it's a lot to manage. It's a lot to manage, and it's like to help facilitate and educate and allow everybody to educate everybody else, and to, you know, who can pick up what at what time. I can't control all of that. And I'm a big control freak, but there's some things, in order for my own sanity, I just have to let go and be like, we can do now. This is another tool now. This film is another tool of being able to kind of like, I don't want to say preach the gospel, but
something like that. I realize we're at time, but I want to pick up a couple comments in the chat. Karen DeLossi, who really coordinated things from Partners for Sacred Places, said, yes, so much church politics, right? And Robin Stamey, who stage managed the whole production, said that she has a new relationship with the grounds themselves, places she now feels welcome that previously felt off limits. So it's interesting, that kind of opening, right, that happened. So I just want to make sure that John gets his question in, and Elisa had a quick question, and just, you're saying no?
No, so I don't have a question. I just want to say, you know, part of what I will say, and this, I'm saying this as a filmmaker, is a little bit of the problem with film is that it lets us off the hook, right? With the experience that I think both the performers and the audiences had in these situations, right? I think there's a version of what, for instance, you know, so the case you brought up earlier, Reggie, where you said, well, that's an audience, that's not a congregation. I think part of what happens is you all are forcing them to grapple with the difference between those two things in that space. And we don't have that same dilemma often as film audiences, because we're more displaced. So it's something powerful looking at how the film allows us to see the complicated relationship between these various audiences who are also being asked to imagine themselves differently as a function of the performances being in spaces that aren't your typical traditional spaces for these performances to take place. And that was really powerful. And your example of that audience congregation distinction is one I think that I want to just hold on to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so in the spirit of the film being a way to continue and maintain some of these conversations, of course, pre-pandemic, we had been all planning together a big screening, which we will still do in conjunction with Partners for Sacred Places and Philadelphia Contemporary, and various other partners and churches with whom you worked in Philadelphia, and spaces around Penn, when we can all sort of be in the same space and time and on the same earthly plane, depending on where we are in past, present, future at that point. But for now, what I want to do is just say a profound thank you. Thank you to Reggie, and of course to the 3 J's, Jasmine, John, and Jawole, for being here today and for taking part in this discussion. And of course, all of you, I'm pointing to the chat section of the Zoom, but all of you who are not in the grid, but who I know have been here with us and listening and contributing and participating in your own ways. Hello to you too, Kate Ramsey. And yeah. And all of this.
Oh my God, Kate, reach out, find me.
We really appreciate it. And it's been a really wonderful semester with you, Reggie, with both our fellows really this spring. Again, if you haven't had a chance to watch the film yet, you can still do so through tomorrow. And I really want to encourage everybody to have a wonderful, wonderful summer. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you,
Thank you all. That was fantastic.
Cover everybody. Thank you. This is amazing. Thank you so much.